Hello, my name's Fond, and this is the 10th DM Diary of the Throne of Rihdar. Hi. This week, the players have, gotten to the inn, as well as finished up their shopping a little bit. We'll start with the group who is currently in the Maplewood Hidden Market, ran by the River Rats. They have more or less done their shopping. They're down there just trying to negotiate some prices. And before they leave, they seem to, mostly Newt at least, seems to talk to this peasant named Quentin Tiest, who has been wanting to assassinate Father Caban and set his father's spirit free. He doesn't really plan on... The assumption is not to actually kill the man, but to... He believes that with the help of Stavros, there's some way to work around this and come to a different conclusion, instead of having to kill him to find the solution. So they talked to him for briefly. They talked to Sleepy-Eyed Rufus, who's been watching this entire time, briefly as well, before they ultimately leave and decide to head to the Springside Inn where Stavros has been. Now, back at the Springside Inn, Stavros has been talking to Shlomo Pigrider, who is this halfling inside this box, and Sir Oinkalot, his pet pig, except he's not paying any attention to this guy at all. He's actually ignoring him so much that Shlomo, who is obviously quite tipsy, is very, very annoyed with him. So, he's following him, trying to get some information, trying to talk to him, but Stavros just is not responding, as Stavros goes back from the bathhouse and reports the damages to Miranda Ildgut and demands to know if Shlomo Pigrider is going to pay for the damages. And after some talking, he says he will. And he talks who he is and things like that. But once again, Stavros isn't having it. And Stavros decides to order some food by himself before the rest of the party gets there. So he might have at least a brief moment of peace. However, that moment of peace won't last long, as Shlomo Pigrider sits on the table, the next table away from him, but on the other side facing him, so he can see him. But Stavros, not paying attention, decides to read a newspaper. As he's reading, his Victor the cook comes out, takes his order, gives him some bread and some food, and when he looks up, he realizes Shlomo Pigrider is not there anymore. Instead, sitting in the chair is Sir Oinkalot, who's now been dressed up in a nice suit, and is sitting up there with a bib, and has its silverware, and for a moment, the pig looks weirdly human. Very weirdly human, which made Stavros have to think if this pig is actually a pig or not. It's very confusing. And then he decides, uh-oh, where is Shlomo at? So he looks around looking for him, but he doesn't find him. But then he feels something under the table, around his waist. Understanding it's him, he quickly kicks. He goes flying out from under the table. Shlomo hits his head on the other table, and then suddenly he stops moving. He starts making noises, making Stavros think that he might be having a seizure or some sort of other medical injury. He quickly runs and gets help. He comes back and he quickly realizes, oh no, he's just drunk and he's hiccuping. Very annoyed by this man, he ignores him and goes back to his food. Around the same time, the party gets there. The party gets there and they begin to converse with Miranda Ildgut. Very quickly, they settle the rooms and they get 2 extra rooms. And they talk about a few things, and they recognize Stavros in the corner, and they go say hi to him. Miranda Ildgut seems to have noticed that Kira isn't just a woman who's hiding her appearance. She notices that she's actually an elf, as she gets a glimpse of her antlers. But she doesn't bring it up right now. As they go on, Kit, played by Phoebus, tries to have a conversation with the pig, which doesn't really go very well. But he seems to be very interested in it. As the party quickly talks to Stavros, Kira gives him the dead man's treasure, a book she had bought in the market, before they all ultimately decide they're going to run off and go to the bathhouse. They all go in there. They all take their individual baths. Kira actually goes to the general area, and since no one else is there vacationing, she more or less has this general bath all to herself. And so she takes a bath. She brings out her jackal, who they've yet to name, and she realizes the jackal has been very stoic. The jackal is well behaved, quiet, doesn't really make noise, pretty stoic and just likes to watch. but she pretty easily gives it a bath, though the water is a little bit uncomfortable for it. And as she's doing a bath, nothing really seems to happen. They all enjoy their moments as they all realize this is the first time in 2 weeks, just about, that they've managed to be clean. It's very refreshing. Inside, Stavros is helping Miranda Ildred set up a table, so whenever everyone gets back, they can all share stories, as they had promised her they would do. And he's also been working and reading this Dead Man's Treasure, which seems to be a life recount of a man who has hid his treasure, and it's very almost dusty and decrepit, like no one really wanted to see it, so he's over here repairing all of it. And at the same time, he's still being constantly pestered by Shlomo Pigrider, who's now using Sir Ointelot as almost like a puppet, and moving his little hoofs around and making a weird little voice. "Oh, I guess you must be piggish then. You don't wish to speak to me because I'm a pig. I get it. I'm so sad. It's so sad being a pig. I'm so sorry that I was born this way. I didn't choose this." And ultimately just bothering him and Miranda Ildred. But eventually the party comes back together. They all sit around this table and they order food from Victor the cook, who gets very irritated by them as they don't know how to order properly. At one point they order a general amount, then they up the amount of ale, and then they try and separate the bill, to the point that Victor the cook threatens to spit in all of their food, and as he storms off to the back, where Miranda Ildred has to calm him down. But eventually all things work out. He brings their food, they pay for it, they all sit down and begin to get ready to share stories as payment to Miranda for her goodwill. Now before this though, an important thing I hadn't mentioned is Miranda did actually end up acting on the information of her finding out that Kira is an elf. Before she went off to the bathhouse, Kira was invited to one of the back area rooms of the Springside Inn, where it turns out Kira is a very suspicious person. And I think this is an important topic I would like to talk about as a TM. I was talking to one of my friends who's played in a game of mine when I first started out, which by no means was that game any good. But I told him that, man, I sure wish some of my players would be less suspicious of my characters. And he just laughed and said, well, of course they're not. You're the DM. Which I thought was funny, because I usually try and use NPCs to get at people, or almost no one's ever a good person. But there are points whenever I try to show my players, or I give actual good people to my players, and they're super suspicious. So much so that even someone who's only done good to them, they still suspect. Things like that. It's like an unending level of suspicion that I can almost cannot convince them not to suspect them. I think there's only one person that they like and do not suspect, and that's Krogol Urtad, the Frogolian who had attempted to save Kit from the constrictor snake. That is the only one that they've not ever been super suspicious of. But everyone else, they're very suspicious of. Mostly because they don't quite understand their motives, and they assume the motives might make them bad, I think. But it's very hard for me to get my players to truly not be suspicious of someone. So whenever she's invited to the back, she tells Stavros and Hawkins, if she's not back in 5 minutes, to bust in the door and see what's up. So as they go to the back, where Miranda kind of opens up, she speaks to her about how she knows she's an elf, and she's just kind of curious about what it means to be an elf. Miranda is an elf. However, she does not have her antlers. She's been a slave all her life, and she's been bought by Duke Gilbert whenever she was a young elf. Something important, if I've not mentioned it before, all elves in my world have antlers. It is a sign of tradition. It is the most important thing to them. Antlers are almost more important, or antlers are more important than one's own life. If you don't have antlers, you have no right to become immortal. Once you lose your antlers, you're no longer an elf, at least by elf standards. It's a tradition thing. So for Kira to have her antlers, she ended up running away from home so they wouldn't be taken from her. And she also knows that she hides them because she knows that's a dead giveaway of who she is. But Miranda, unbeknownst to all this, brings it up just curious about what it means to be an elf. She doesn't really know anything about what elves are. She never really met her family before she was sold into slavery and before she lost her own antlers. She's asking questions. She's opening up about how her father, Duke Gilbert, has kept this slave collar on her. Now she's not allowed to leave Maplewood. so the most she can do is hear stories from others. That's all she can do. And she's given up on escape. Everything's going to shit in the world, and she just doesn't care anymore. There's nothing to go for, there's no reason, so she just has given up. However, she seems to be interested in potentially hearing more about what it means to be an elf. So she's digging around. Kira, not trusting her, has a weapon at the ready. But she quickly realizes that she's just pulling out a nice silk robe and a very ornate key. But, surprising to me, it is one of these moments where you start to really understand what type of character your players are playing. Is whenever Kira the wood elf ended up rejecting the nice silk robe and almost rejected the key as well. She ended up giving it to Stavros instead. She is not one that likes luxuries. She's not one who believes that she needs those. She's someone who doesn't sleep in a tent. She always sleeps out in bushes and things like that. She's a true wood elf in that matter. So she rejects it, and she does not seem to wish to give any information to Mirinda, but Mirinda doesn't push it. It was simply an offer. At the same time, about 5 minutes has passed, and Hawkins, played by Swills, the lizard folk, busts through the door, looking for her. But at that moment, a very strange thing was happening. Mirinda had accidentally loosened the bandages that she has wrapped around her arms, and they came off, revealing a bunch of bruises, scrapes, and injuries, showing to Kira that she has been being beaten by Duke Gilbert Ildred. There's been a lot of abuse going on, cruelties happening to her that she's been hiding. At the same time, Hawkins busts through the door to make sure Kira's alright. Kira says she's alright, but Hawkins, with a bad perception roll, a nat 1, sees these cloths coming off, but cannot tell that they are being put back on. Instead, to him, it looks like they're being taken off. So he gets the wrong idea that Mirinda may have a thing for Kira, and quickly says sorry, excuses himself, and says he will not check on them again, which creates this weird atmosphere between him and Kira. Obviously, Kira knows he's wrong, but Hawkins believes what he saw. So he quickly skedaddles. And annoyed, Kira continues on. And then Mo5, who plays Kira, he did something very interesting. I thought was very interesting. One of those moments that a player does when you're like, I'm very glad you're in my game. I'm really glad you're in my game. I really enjoy role-playing with you, and I'm really glad we're having this character interaction. Because Mirinda, going to put back the robes, was leaning back down, putting everything back up, and Kira was about to leave. And Kira simply asked to Mirinda, do you like Duke Gilbert, your father? Mirinda replied, I appreciate what he's done for me. It's very kind that he got me out of slavery. Many worse things had happened, but I can't say I appreciate the fact that he is so controlling. I don't quite like it. So Kira changes her question to be one a little more direct. Would you be sad if Duke Gilbert Ildred died? Silence filled the room. Both of them, their backs to each other, one looking into the dresser, the other looking out the door. Mirinda first answers by saying, it would be unfortunate, I do believe. Cut off by Kira. Yes or no? She continues, I could only wish that a better fate could befall him, but ultimately, if my father is to die, I would not be that upset. Kira simply nods her head and walks out. Door shuts behind her. A moment of very obviously one saying that she may take action to try and free Mirinda Ildred. One of a silent, where no one has to say directly what's being said, but everyone understands. A simple moment that just between me and Mo5, Mirinda, and Kira, two elves of different natures, but almost in the same boat. As she walks out and goes takes a bath. I greatly appreciated that. So much so. I need to tell Mo5 I enjoy him in my game more. I'm genuinely super pleased to have him in my game. And to some extent, I love all my players equally for the most part, but to some extent I'm surprised as to how much I actually enjoy having Mo5 in my game. That he as a player has reached my expectations, and to many extents there are certain points where he goes beyond what I expect, where he becomes... Mo5 does something that some of the other players don't succeed at very much, or as often. Swills does quite often, but he does something... There are moments that he does things as Kira, that Kira does things, and to me it feels like Mo5 is part of the world, that Kira is part of the world. It's not a player who doesn't quite understand where they belong in this world or things. Instead, I'm watching two people from Orbitus, the world I've made, interacting based on who they are. He sometimes embodies the verisimilitude I try to protect and I try to grow. And for that encounter was just one example of some things I genuinely love, some of my favorite moments from my game. And a lot of times they come from Kira. Anyway, after that, after they all go bathe and everything, they eventually come back to the inn where they sit down and they begin to talk. Shlomo Pigrider makes his way over and joins, saying that he's a bard. He's been going around collecting stories and such, and he's been here on vacation. And he's super pissed that someone has destroyed and vandalized these springs, so now he can't enjoy his vacation properly. But they ask him for some stories, and he tells them a story about the virtuous Emperor Rihdar, the emperor of the planet, of the people's empire of Orbitus, who ended up dying about 30 years ago, creating the Continental Liberation Wars in his death. The story was about what really happened whenever the Beast Folk attacked and managed to kill him, and why they didn't take the throne. He said that it was a story he heard from a Beast Folk in a bar once, who said that Rihdar actually asked for them to kill him. Whenever they busted the doors, Virtuous Emperor Rihdar did not fight back. There was not some glorious battle. Instead, he was on his knees. And as if in the last sanity he could muster in his madness, in the curse of Orbitus, the curse of the Reans, Brataman's vengeance, all names of the curse, the madness that ends up taking over anyone who becomes the emperor of Orbitus. As if mustering the last of his sentience and overcoming the madness for one moment, he sat on his knees and asked for the beast folk to kill him before it was too late. And so they did. And supposedly out of respect for his last moment of sacrifice, they did not take the throne for themselves, which was a sign of respect to him, but ended up making them the most hated race, and ended up making the world go into civil war all over as everything fell apart. So for a brief moment they heard a story of a potential truth, but no one really knows what happened. Bards are highly respected as people who know history and share stories, but once again, that is a very high piece of information people are looking for. No one knows the truth. After that, it's the players' turn to talk. They tell Miranda of the time they spent in Nero Coliseum, whenever they were first met each other, whenever they fought against the orphans and the 5 kings, and they had their battles, their moments, when they met Alfonso and Ditzer and the Night Lords and things like that, whenever they went by the name the Oddities. And this struck something with Shlomo Pigrider. He had actually been there at Nero Coliseum. He had watched them fight, but he did not realize who they were. It had been a month and a half ago. But he did not know that these were the same people. So, in a moment he stands up and says, "What? Are you the Oddities?" Which shocked the players briefly. Someone knew them. Someone knew who they were. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing, that he knew who they were. And he pushes on to tell them that he was there, that he saw things, and everything else. And they had mentioned that Alfonso and Ditzer had given them a mission. So this, of course, piped Shlomo Pigrider's... he's a bard looking for stories. So this greatly interested him. So he pushed on. What was the mission? They wouldn't tell him. He kept pushing and pushing and pushing, until eventually they said they'll have to kill him. But that wasn't enough. He stopped for a moment, and then he said, "How about this? I'll give you some information, and if you deem it worthy enough, you can give me more information." Talking to Kira. Kira hesitated at first, but ultimately agreed, to where he would say to where he would tell them about something they have yet to hear about. The tragedy at the Nero Infirmary. The story of how some priests were casting some magic to revive someone, and then it got out of hand and created a disaster that has hurt everyone in the infirmary. And that the only piece of evidence that came from it was a single bloody rock. And then he'd go on to look at Kira, his voice going lower. And there was only one person who used rots during that entire tournament, and who was also a participant who would have frequented the infirmary, and also someone who might have something against humans. That is you, Kira. You're the rot thrower, are you not? Of course, Kira rejected this idea, but it was her. And Kit, who had not realized this in character, Kit as a character had a click. He realized from the information he had gotten earlier that it was Kira who had done that. And this had pushed the buttons of Kira, and Kira wasn't very happy. But she obliged and gave some of the information. However, the information not would suffice. This would be the information that the mission that they were put on by Alfonso Ditzer that they would tell the Shlomo Pigrider. More or less, this was all it was. He's an important person, and he's looking for something important. An important item, an important something, and that's what our mission is. Shlomo would rebuke and say, well, of course important people are looking for important information. That's not helpful at all. Tell me more. But they would refuse. And this would infuriate Shlomo Pigrider. He would go on to argue with them and argue and say, that's not fair at all. But they would refuse, and they would threaten to kill him, and then he would eventually get so upset that he would offer to die to hear the information. But they would not kill him. So he called them cowards. During that same time, something had been brought up about Alfonso and Ditzer through Mirinda. And Kira was very, very predominant on claiming that you cannot trust Alfonso and Ditzer. That he's the type of person who just says things to make you think he's on your side. But he's really the worst type of person there is, the worst type of leader. And that if he's the leader, he should be able to say things and encourage the Kadoi nature of liking humans and not liking other races to go away, which she's not wrong by. But Shlomo Pigrider, being upset by this, went on to argue that Alfonso and Ditzer probably couldn't have done that. It's hard to judge him that way because his words have so much impact. If he was to suddenly say that humans aren't the best race, that might cause riots and all kinds of things. It's only 5 years ago that the Crimson Riot happened, that the government almost toppled. It's too dangerous. And that he is the voice of Kadoi. I'm sure he has reason that he's a nice guy. So there became a big argument about if he actually is or is not a good person. It started making tensions rise. Even though Shlomo was not a human and had suffered discrimination, the voice of Kadoi, Alfonso and Ditzer, is a very popular person loved by all, for the most part. So to hear such terminology, even as a non-human, was almost as being insulted yourself. Almost as if someone you really look up to is being insulted. You wish to defend them. So this huge argument happened. Until eventually, it got so heated and everyone got so annoyed that Stravos picked up Shlomo Pigrider, turned around to the other table, and slammed him full-bodily onto the table, making him cough up blood, and barely missing a surprise attack by Sir Oinkalot, who tried to defend its master. Suddenly, the air of the room went awkward, almost as if something that shouldn't have happened. Voices stop, everyone's mood seems to turn, as Mirinda gets up to leave, and Shlomo gets on Sir Oinkalot. Sir Oinkalot glares at him and walks away. And that's more or less where the session ended. But I would like to speak about this awkwardness. Normally, you wish to end a session on a good note, on a high note, or suspense. You don't almost always end it on suspense or a high note, or they just end it on something. I've never once ended on a session on an awkward moment, something so awkward that everyone at the table feels off-put. It was a strange experience. I don't know if I'd want to do it intentionally again. Maybe. But I think it really set the mood and left the tone of the situation. So I don't think it's a problem that I didn't end off on a high note or a good stopping point like that. The fact that I ended up on an awkward moment made everyone leave the table, the virtual table, feeling a little bit awkward about it. Which might seem like a bad idea. Who wants to leave a D&D game feeling awkward? But it's not awkward because something weird happened. It's awkward because that's what your character should feel. It should be what you feel in this moment. And it was so bad, I'm still a pretty rusty and new DM, but I've never been so invested in a character to where I genuinely embody it so much that I also get awkward and annoyed. I was genuinely upset with Stavros, Shmeeb's character, whenever he slammed Shlomo Pigrider, who I was acting as, onto the table. At that moment, I genuinely felt like I was Shlomo Pigrider. I was so annoyed by what had happened. And to some extent, that did carry over just a little bit, because whenever Stavros turned around, he simply heard the word, bitch, behind him. But he didn't sound like Shlomo Pigrider. And he couldn't really bring himself to believe that it was the pig, even though the pig had been acting human. But this was mostly, there was not really a reason for this, besides I thought it'd be a little bit funny, I guess. But that has now set up the tone that perhaps the pig is not a pig itself. Perhaps the pig is actually something else. But that moment was a very interesting moment, one I've not had before until now, where everyone was so kind of in the moment and in the situation that I genuinely got annoyed. The other players were feeling awkward about this. And the session ended on an awkward note, where after the session I was like, thanks for the D&D, that was fun, that was sick. And then everyone just kind of went their own ways, and no one talked about anything afterwards. Not that everyone, my players don't often, I wish they would a little bit more. It doesn't really matter though. Once the game ends, we don't really talk about the session all too much. Briefly we will, but we don't really talk about it too much, things usually move on. But this time everyone just kind of left on their own ways. That's how awkward it was. So I just wanted to bring up that. I don't think it was necessarily a problem, but it was a very interesting observation and experience I've had with this. But the session ended on that note with Miranda leaving and this awkward tension in the air. And Stavros just slammed this man onto the table. But, thank you. My name is Fond. I appreciate you listening and reading this summary. This is the 10th DM Diary of the Throne of Rihdar. Thank you to my players who play. Thank you to my viewers who watch me live on Twitch every Saturday. You can watch us live at twitch.tv, Fond the Jester, every Saturday at noon CST. Maybe a little bit afterwards, but just around that time. Thirdly, thank you to anyone who has supported this in any way, viewing this, watching the VODs, being there, my friends, anyone who's interested in what I do. I appreciate it a lot. Until next time, I hope this fun continues to happen. I'll see you in the next stream or the next DM Diary. Goodbye.